James Archibald Hope's The Military Memoirs of an Infantry Officer offers a vivid account of his experiences in the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Hope shares insights into battles, soldier life, and the camaraderie of the infantry, providing a first-hand glimpse into the challenges and resilience of military service. These are his words. Let's begin. The various parts of the grand military machine being prepared, an order from the Great Master to have the whole assembled and ready to move by the middle of May finally appeared. The crisis was now approaching, which would either bind Spain in eternal chains or rescue her from the grasp of her powerful neighbour. All eyes in Spain and England were fixed on the scene of active operations, following Lord Wellington's movements throughout the campaign with unceasing anxiety. On the 15th of May, Sir Thomas Graham crossed the Douro near Miranda del Douro with the left wing of the Allied army, ascended the right bank to the Wellesley, crossed it, and advanced on Zamora. The enemy retreated towards Toro at his approach. The 2nd Division assembled in a plain a few miles in front of Bayer on the 20th of May. On the 23rd, we were reviewed by Sir Rowland Hill. Lieutenant General, the Honourable William Stewart, appeared at our head for the first time on this occasion. The following morning we advanced to Robera, continued to Metella the next day, and on the 26th we resumed our route towards Salamanca, which was then occupied by a small corps of the enemy under General Villate. Lord Wellington, having formed a junction with Sir Rowland Hill, advanced with a portion of the cavalry to a height on the left bank of the Tormes, directly opposite Salamanca. After reconnoitring the enemy, he ordered the cavalry and some horse artillery to cross the river, some by the bridge of Salamanca, the rest by a ford slightly upstream, and attack Villate, who was just leaving the city. The order was cheerfully obeyed, and the attackers were successful. After a fairly sharp engagement, the French were defeated, suffering 300 casualties, including killed, wounded, and prisoners. Of the prisoners, 140 were captured. After the infantry crossed the Tormes, they encamped on a plain about half a mile above Salamanca. That afternoon, many respectable people from the city visited our camp. The ladies, particularly curious, pulled aside the folds of our tents without the slightest ceremony, eager to get a full view of Los Ingleses. At first we were quite embarrassed by their boldness, especially since we were dressed in anything but formal attire. Early in the morning of the 27th, commanding officers were instructed to have their battalions in the best order possible to pass in review before the Marquis of Wellington during the march. Around 7 o'clock, the head of the column moved out of camp towards Salamanca, keeping the city's walls on our left until we reached the northern gate. From there, we made a quarter wheel to the right and proceeded towards Toro. About 4 or 5 miles from Salamanca, the Marquis took position on a height with his numerous staff. As each battalion approached, it halted briefly to dress its companies and then passed by at a steady pace. The morning was exceptionally beautiful, with not a cloud in sight, and the troops made a magnificent appearance. As each unit passed, the Marquis offered some flattering remarks, and as the last company saluted, he turned to Sir Rowland Hill and said, "Sir Rowland, I will take the gloss off your corps this campaign." How well he kept his promise the campaign would later show. We continued our route and arrived at Orbada in the afternoon, where we encamped. During the winter and spring months, the regiments comprising the 2nd Division had been so widely detached that brigade drills were impractical. Now, however, the few days of rest at Orbada provided an opportunity for officers commanding brigades to conduct field manoeuvres almost every morning. Some officers also organized games to entertain both soldiers and officers, occasionally joining in the activities themselves. Every officer with proper aspirations seeks to gain and maintain a high reputation among his peers. The desire for praise, when pursued through commendable actions, is admirable, as it has often inspired soldiers to perform heroic deeds when other motivations failed. However, if an officer seeks popularity by currying favour with the men, his pursuit of praise becomes dishonourable. Familiarity with the men leads to a loss of command, while harshness leads to similar consequences. The correct approach is to be kind without being familiar, attend to their comforts, address their grievances, and show by every action that their welfare is sincerely valued. This is the only honourable path to the kind of popularity an officer should seek. We broke camp at Orbada on the 3rd of June and spent the night on the left bank of the Corena River. That evening, 200 French prisoners passed us on their way to England, captured by the Hussar Brigade and Don Julian Sanchez. 2 arches of the bridge at Toro, destroyed in 1812, were temporarily repaired with wood by the morning of the 4th, though the repairs were so makeshift that only one man could cross at a time. The boards were so unsteady that but for General Stewart, who remained on the north side of the broken arches until all the infantry had crossed, I would have fallen into the river. The general, seeing me stumble near the edge, sprang forward and caught my hand just as I was about to plunge head first into the water. The staff and baggage animals crossed by a ford slightly above the bridge, with some of the smaller animals swimming. After the division had crossed, we moved 5 miles towards Valladolid and encamped. The next morning we resumed our march, advancing 5 leagues and encamping again. Here we could find neither wood nor long grass, nor any substitutes for fuel to boil our kettles. We had no choice but to request the chief magistrate of a nearby town to provide us with 2 or 3 houses as compensation for fuel. On the 6th we moved towards Valladolid, but when we were just a few miles away, we changed direction and marched to Cigales. The pursuit of the enemy continued on the 7th, taking us to Duenas, where we encamped. There we encountered a ghastly sight. The bodies of 2 French soldiers lying on a dunghill, placed there by their own comrades, not the Spaniards, and one of them had been placed there before he was even dead. The dunghill was right beneath the window of a house used as a hospital, and this kind of behaviour is simply inexcusable. On the 8th, we advanced to Torquemada. That night, a hurricane-force wind and torrential rain battered us. The next day, and the one following, we trudged towards Burgos through knee-deep mud. After crossing the Arlanzon River on the afternoon of the 10th, we encamped on a height about a league from its left bank. On the 11th, we moved 1 league forward to Los Valbasas and encamped, and on the 12th, we drew 5 leagues closer to Burgos, where we expected a major engagement. Just as we had settled for the night, the sound of artillery fire called us to arms. Within minutes, we were marching towards the action, but after advancing a mile, we were stopped at a deep stream, its bridge destroyed by the enemy. Once we overcame this obstacle and advanced another 2 miles, we halted. Half an hour later, we were ordered to return to our original camp, both wet and exhausted. This skirmish between our light troops, horse artillery, and the enemy's rear guard ended in our favour, with the enemy driven back, leaving some dead, wounded, and 1 cannon behind. At 5 o'clock on the morning of the 13th of June, Joseph Bonaparte, in what must have been a moment of insanity, blew up the castle of Burgos. This unexpected act was a clear indication of his future intentions, making it obvious that he had no intention of giving us battle south of the Ebro River. The destruction of this fortress was the first tangible result of the British general's brilliant strategy. As Joseph had planned to defend the Douro, Lord Wellington ordered Sir Thomas Graham to cross the river, as mentioned earlier, and to press the enemy from his right flank, driving him out of every position. Having succeeded in the first part of his plan, the hero of Barossa continued this strategy all the way to the Ebro, which he crossed on the 14th at Arenas. By outmanoeuvring the enemy, he opened a passage for the Central Division on the 15th, and Sir Rowland Hill's corps the following day. As we descended into the valley of the Ebro, the road first led down a deep ravine, then zigzagged down the face of a high, rugged mountain. As we marched, the bands of the various battalions played favourite tunes, with the rocks on either side echoing the trumpet's shrill calls, the clarion's sweet notes, and the wild, murmuring sound of the bagpipes. Bonaparte had decreed that all the territory north of the Ebro was annexed to France, so as we crossed the bridge, each battalion's band struck up the downfall of Paris, accompanied by the soldiers' cheers, making the hills and valleys ring with jubilation. After crossing the Ebro, we marched along its left bank, with the river to our left and an imposing rugged mountain to our right. In some places, the road had been carved out of the rock, which overhung both the road and the river in certain areas. It was astonishing that the enemy had abandoned such a strong defensive position without even attempting to defend the Ebro line, though we were certainly not displeased by their retreat. After following the river for 2 or 3 miles, we turned right and marched another league before halting to encamp. On the 17th, we continued towards Vitoria, covering 3 leagues before encamping in a plain where we found some of our comrades preparing scalding soup. On the 18th and 19th, we advanced further towards Vitoria, and on the evening of the 19th, we encamped on a height overlooking Miranda del Ebro. On the 18th, the Light Division had engaged a body of the enemy guarding stores, inflicting severe losses. The same division was similarly engaged the following day. On the 20th, the entire army closed to within 3 or 4 leagues of Vitoria, where Joseph had taken up a defensive position the previous day, preparing to give battle. A little after daybreak on the 21st, the troops were ordered to be in readiness to march at a moment's notice. But whether we were to be engaged in pursuing or combating the enemy, no one could tell. Appearances, however, were in favour of the latter, for instead of marching at the expiration of the usual period allowed to intervene between the sounding of the warning horn and the advance, we remained 2 hours in camp, waiting instructions before we could move to perform our part in the grand drama of the day. About 5 o'clock, however, all suspense was at an end. "To arms" resounded through the camp. In a few minutes every man was at his post, and in a few more we were on the road to Puebla, where we arrived about 8. On leaving our encampment, the rain, which till then had fallen in gentle showers, entirely ceased, and soon after the sun burst from behind the gloomy curtain to spread his cheering rays over fields yet unstained with blood, over rivers whose streams, meandering through Zadora's vale, were yet undisturbed by the strife of man, to cheer the sons of freedom on their march to the field of honour, hundreds of whom were destined, long before he had finished his daily course, to take their departure for that bourne from whence no traveller returns. On quitting our camp, we were still in ignorance as to the nature of the service in which we were to be employed, but upon our arrival at Puebla, the secret was of necessity communicated to us, for the enemy held the heights immediately above us, and we were then not more than 3 miles from the main body of their army. On this important fact becoming currently known, a smile of satisfaction played on the cheeks of the soldiers, and during the time the officers were employed in inspecting the arms, some of the old veterans encouraged the juniors by relating their deeds of former days. Others calculated the probable numbers of the foe. A third party speculated on how long the battle would continue, and all made themselves sure of glorious victory. The high road from Madrid to Vitoria, which runs through Puebla and then up the left bank of the Zadora, takes a sharp turn to the right 2 miles in front of the village. Here it leaves the river at some distance on the left, and after passing through the town of Sabujana de Alava, leads almost straight towards Vitoria. Pursuing this route, it was a little in front of the bend in the road that we first beheld the dense dark masses of the enemy, arrayed in order of battle, and the advanced bodies of our own and the French cavalry, not more than 200 or 300 paces from each other. The scene which now presented itself to our view was animated and grand beyond description. On the right bank of the Zadora, and on the face of a pretty high, rugged hill, thousands of our companions were moving from their stations and preparing to join us in the grand struggle. On our right, Murillo and his Spaniards were climbing the face of Puebla's heights, and in our rear, battalion after battalion was closing up to be ready to execute the commands of their leader. In our front, the sight was imposing. Turning our eyes to the right, we beheld the left of the French army posted on the summit of the heights of Puebla, supported by a strong body of infantry and some pieces of artillery, a considerable portion of which was stationed in and around a clump of trees near to the back of the hill, and about 1.5 miles in rear of their most advanced detachment on the heights. Immediately before us stood the village of Sabujana de Alava, in which, and on a height a little to its right, the centre divisions of the French army were posted. This height, which partly commanded the high road as well as a great part of the river and valley of the Zadorra, was literally covered with infantry and at least 100 pieces of artillery. In a thick wood a little farther to their right, Joseph had thrown a considerable body of infantry to protect the passage of the Zadorra and keep up an unbroken line of communication between the right centre divisions and the extreme right of his army, which extended along the river to a point rather beyond Vitoria. It is a singular fact that instead of damping the spirits of our soldiers, the latter appeared more and more delighted as the French battalions successively appeared from behind their numerous artillery. One heart and one soul seemed to animate the whole. All wished for the commencement of the engagement, not so much from a desire to brave death in the many thousand shapes in which the soldier sees the grim king on the field of strife, but because they had been afraid that the enemy might retire, and as a battle appeared inevitable, might ultimately occupy a position presenting greater obstacles to an attack than any which they could discover on the plains of Vitoria. With this feeling, therefore, and the fixed resolution to conquer or die, the right wing of the Allied army moved forward in silence to begin the tremendous conflict. That concludes the 8th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.